So continuing where we left off on the intrinsic controls of GFR, or glomerular filtration rate, recall that the intrinsic controls were also referred to as renal autoregulation, and we were just about to examine what happened when systemic blood pressure dropped. So when systemic blood pressure gets low, the afferent arteriole is going to dilate, which dilation of the afferent arteriole is going to help to increase blood flow by decreasing the resistance to the glomerular capillaries, and keep blood flow to the glomerular capillaries high and help to maintain a normal GFR of about 125 milliliters a minute, even when systemic blood pressure starts to drop. So now that we've finished with the myogenic mechanism, we can turn our attention to the tubular-glomerular feedback mechanism, which is using sodium concentrations in the filtrate to regulate GFR. So what it's going to do is that the kidney tubules will essentially monitor, or cells in the kidney tubules as part of the juxtaglomerular complex are going to monitor sodium concentrations in the filtrate. And so when sodium concentration in the filtrate is high, we're going to see that the afferent arteriole constricts, which is going to decrease GFR. And when sodium concentrations in the filtrate start to drop, we're going to see that the afferent arteriole will dilate, which will increase GFR. And that really kind of summarizes the intrinsic controls, the myogenic mechanism as well as the tubular-glomerular mechanism. The myogenic mechanism is strictly using the smooth muscle that's in the walls of the afferent arteriole to control blood flow through the afferent arteriole and into the glomerular capillaries. Tubular glomerular feedback is monitoring sodium concentrations, and it's using the sodium concentrations that it's detecting in the kidney tubules in order to determine what's going to happen with either dilation or constriction of the afferent arteriole that's leading to those glomerular capillaries. So very similar to one another in general, with really the one exception being that tubular glomerular feedback is monitoring sodium concentrations. The extrinsic controls, on the other hand, the term extrinsic refers to controls that are external to the kidney, right? So that is controls that are coming from other places in the body. And the extrinsic controls really are, it's the responsibility of the extrinsic control, or the responsibility rather, of the extrinsic controls to maintain systemic blood pressure throughout the rest of the body, regardless of what the kidney is doing. Because the intrinsic controls are intrinsic or within the kidney. That is, the intrinsic controls are, their job is to maintain GFR regardless of what's going on. So in that way, the intrinsic controls can kind of be looked at as the kidney essentially being selfish, right? So the kidney is just trying to do its job regardless of what's going on in the rest of the body. And the extrinsic controls are really there to kind of keep the kidney under control, to help in terms of filtrate production and blood flow to the kidney, to help maintain blood flow and blood pressure in other places in the body other than the kidney. So really the extrinsic controls are really just trying to make sure that other systems in the body are receiving blood pressure and blood flow as they should be in order to perform their functions as well. So we saw that the two intrinsic controls of GFR and how they operate were the myogenic mechanism and the tubular glomerular feedback, as I mentioned already. And now we'll examine the two extrinsic controls in the last bullet point here before we scroll down to other topics. The two extrinsic controls that maintain systemic blood pressure is a hormonal control, and the other is a neural control. The main hormonal mechanism is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, which we'll examine in a little bit more detail when we get to the endocrine module in Module 7. The way that the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism works is that if we take, for example, when blood pressure falls, that is systemic blood pressure falls, a cell type called the granular cell in the juxtaglomerular complex is going to secrete a substance called renin. And renin will then stimulate the production of an enzyme that's called angiotensin II. And angiotensin II is an enzyme that then stimulates the adrenal gland, which is an endocrine gland, to secrete a steroid hormone called aldosterone. And aldosterone, it exerts its effect on the kidney tubules. And what it does is aldosterone stimulates the kidney tubules to produce sodium-potassium pumps. And what those sodium-potassium pumps will do is they will actively, using ATP, they will actively pump sodium from the filtrate back into the bloodstream. And so we see that the more aldosterone that's being secreted, the more sodium-potassium pumps are being created in the kidney tubules, and they're going to help reabsorb more sodium from the filtrate and put it back into the bloodstream. One of the things that we tend to see is that water follows sodium by diffusion. So that is, even though sodium is being actively transported back into the bloodstream, water is going to follow it by osmosis, which is a passive transport process. And when that water follows that sodium, that's going to help to increase both blood volume and blood pressure. We see that the opposite is going to happen when blood pressure is high. That is, we're going to get less renin being secreted, which is going to lead to less angiotensin II being produced and less aldosterone, or smaller amounts of aldosterone being secreted from the adrenal gland. And so that's going to result in less sodium and water being reabsorbed from the filtrate back into the bloodstream. So it's going to stay in the filtrate, and that sodium and that water is going to be lost to the urine. The neural mechanism uses neurotransmitters, which are both neurotransmitters that have effects on blood pressure. These two neurotransmitters are epinephrine and norepinephrine. And when epinephrine and norepinephrine are secreted in greater concentrations, they cause vasoconstriction. And this is particularly helpful when blood pressure is low. So we see a lot of epinephrine and norepinephrine being released to constrict the blood vessels, help increase that resistance, and increase that blood pressure. And that will help to maintain systemic blood pressure when blood pressure starts to drop or decline. And the opposite will occur when blood pressure is high. That is, less epinephrine, less norepinephrine will be secreted, and that will cause vasodilation, relaxation of the smooth muscle in the blood vessels, and that's going to help to reduce systemic blood pressure at a time when systemic blood pressure may be elevated or may be high. So moving on to the next set of topics here. Let's we briefly summarized how the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism worked in the previous bullet point there, so I won't go over it again here. Next, we'll move on to looking at, once again, how norepinephrine and epinephrine released by the nervous system help to regulate blood pressure when blood pressure starts to change. So, specifically, these two hormones, or these two neurotransmitters, which sort of act like hormones, and we'll actually review them again in the endocrine system. So probably the proper term to use for these is neurohormones, just because they act like hormones, because they are secreted into the bloodstream, but they are made by neurons. So in part they are neurotransmitter, in part they are hormone. So, and the boundary, the distinction between a hormone and a neurotransmitter is very, very small. And we see, and we'll see even further when we get to the endocrine system, that some hormones are indeed made by neurons. So it is very appropriate to call these neurohormones. But the hormones / neurotransmitters, epinephrine and norepinephrine, what they will do is, when blood pressure is low, as I mentioned earlier, is that it will both of those neurotransmitters will stimulate vasoconstriction, cause the smooth muscle in blood vessels to contract, decrease their diameter, which is going to increase the resistance to blood flow, as Poiseuille's law highlights, and that's going to help to increase blood pressure, but at a cost to reducing GFR, typically. So just because when blood pressure starts to increase, the afferent arteriole will start to constrict to reduce blood flow to the glomerular capillaries to protect it from rupturing. And the opposite will occur when blood pressure is high. The nervous system is going to still secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, but at slightly smaller or significantly smaller concentrations than it would when blood pressure is low. So what that's going to do is that's going to cause the smooth muscle in those blood vessels to start to relax. The blood vessels will start to dilate. Blood pressure will start to drop. And usually as a result of that, GFR is going to increase. We'll look at a condition called anuria just really briefly. Anuria it basically means little to no urine output. So anything less than 50 milliliters of urine output per day is our definition of anuria. Typically it's caused by kidney failure or obstructions. So kidney stones can obstruct the flow of urine from the kidney through the ureters, or from the ureters to the urethra, that kind of thing. Or even kidney tumors can obstruct the production and flow of urine from the kidneys through the entirety of the urinary system. Could also be caused by enlarged prostate glands in males because that restricts the ability of urine to leave the urinary bladder and enter the urethra. It can also, in some situations, be caused by extreme dehydration, so where the body is just so dehydrated that the kidneys have very much slowed in their release of excess water through the urine. So when we're extremely dehydrated, our kidneys and the kidney tubules are going to try to reabsorb as much water from the filtrate as they can, just to preserve that water as much as possible. And usually as a result, very little urine output will occur. So let's next look at how sodium and water are moved from the filtrate back into the blood during what we call tubular reabsorption. So there's reabsorption of necessary materials and nutrients from the kidney tubules. And we're also going to look at which parts of the tubule that sodium and water are being reabsorbed from. So we'll start with sodium first. Typically sodium is being pumped from the filtrate back into the blood by sodium-potassium pumps, as I mentioned earlier. Those sodium-potassium pumps require ATP energy, so that is an active process because the kidney is actually having to use ATP energy to move sodium from the filtrate back into the bloodstream. Typically that reabsorption, or that pumping of sodium, is going to occur in the ascending limb of the nephron loop. That's the normal place where the kidney is going to function to reabsorb a lot of sodium. The reabsorption of sodium can also be supplemented by reabsorption from the distal convoluted tubule or the collecting duct if high amounts of aldosterone are being secreted by the adrenal gland. So that steroid hormone, aldosterone, is going to help to promote the formation of sodium-potassium pumps in both the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. So reabsorption of additional sodium can occur in the distal tubule and the collecting duct if high amounts of aldosterone are present. Water is typically going to be reabsorbed by osmosis, which is a passive transport mechanism, and water is typically going to follow sodium. So when sodium is being pumped, reabsorbed back into the bloodstream from the filtrate, water is typically going to follow it by osmosis. And water reabsorption typically occurs in the proximal convoluted tubule, so that's where the majority of most water reabsorption takes place, just like where the majority of other nutrients and electrolytes are being reabsorbed in the proximal tubule, and as well as the descending limb of the nephron loop. So the descending limb of the nephron loop is specifically and only permeable to water. It's not permeable to any other substance. So those are kind of the normal places where water reabsorption will take place. And if there is a lot of antidiuretic hormone being secreted, then the collecting duct will have a large amount of water aquaporins, which are channels through the cell membranes by which water can diffuse by osmosis from the filtrate back into the bloodstream. So as we highlighted there just a second ago, tubular reabsorption of sodium is an active process because the kidney has to invest ATP energy in fueling those sodium-potassium pumps in order to move that sodium from the filtrate back into the bloodstream. Reabsorption of water is a passive process because it's typically following where sodium goes, and water is making use of small protein channels in the cell membranes that are called aquaporins, and aquaporins do not require ATP energy in order for water to move through them. We talked a little bit about the role of the sodium-potassium pumps and the aquaporins already, mentioning that the sodium-potassium pumps use ATP to pump sodium from the filtrate into the bloodstream, and aquaporins are the passive transport channels that allow water to diffuse by osmosis from the filtrate back into the bloodstream. So now let's take a look at where a lot of that reabsorption is taking place in all the major structures of the kidney tubules, starting at the proximal convoluted tubule. The proximal convoluted tubule, which here I have abbreviated PCT, that is where 65% of the filtrate volume is reabsorbed by a normal, healthy, functioning kidney. So that means that the proximal tubule is the place where really the bulk of the reabsorption of the necessary water and nutrients is going to take place. And then the kidney can use the other parts of the kidney tubules to kind of fine-tune what is going to be in the present in the filtrate, and therefore by extension in the urine as soon as it's finished processing it. So we see that in the proximal tubule, there's a lot of water being reabsorbed, as well as sodium, bicarbonate, glucose, and amino acids. So really the majority of the nutrients that appear in the filtrate are reabsorbed by the proximal tubule. The descending limb of the nephron loop, so that is the initial segment, the initial part of the descending loop, or the descending limb of the nephron loop, is only permeable to water, so there's only aquaporins found in the walls of that structure. And then that filtrate will make a hairpin turn and move up the ascending limb of the nephron loop, and in the ascending limb of the nephron loop, we see that that part of the nephron loop is only permeable to sodium because there's only sodium-potassium pumps in there. There's no aquaporins in there. And so the nephron loop is typically where water and sodium are both reabsorbed in fairly high concentrations back into the bloodstream. Now, the distal convoluted tubule will reabsorb sodium if aldosterone is being secreted by the adrenal gland. The collecting duct, which is not part of the nephron, but it is still an important structure in helping to fine-tune what's in the filtrate at that point, because the collecting duct is the last place where the kidney can modify the filtrate. Anything that leaves the collecting duct at that point is going to be lost in the urine. So that's the kidney's kind of last chance to reabsorb anything that it needs or potentially needs from the filtrate before it's lost to the urine. So the collecting duct will function to reabsorb sodium if aldosterone is being secreted, and it will function, the collecting duct will function to reabsorb water if antidiuretic hormone is being secreted. So we'll summarize since we started talking about hormones, we'll summarize the roles of these three hormones: antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone, and atrial natriuretic peptide have on, we'll look at how all three of those hormones briefly have an effect on the reabsorption of certain substances from the filtrate. Antidiuretic hormone is a substance that specifically regulates the reabsorption of water from the filtrate. And antidiuretic hormone primarily functions and works in the collecting duct because the hormone essentially tells the collecting duct to create aquaporins. And when those aquaporins are created, that's going to allow water to diffuse from the filtrate back into the bloodstream. So antidiuretic hormone is specifically looking to control water reabsorption as filtrate moves through the collecting duct. Aldosterone and atrial natriuretic peptide both function to reabsorb sodium. Or I'm sorry, not reabsorb sodium, but control either the increased reabsorption of sodium or allowing sodium to remain in the filtrate. Aldosterone promotes the reabsorption of sodium from the filtrate in both the distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting duct. So aldosterone is going to function to stimulate the creation of sodium-potassium pumps in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. Whereas atrial natriuretic peptide essentially does the opposite of aldosterone. It inhibits the reabsorption of sodium from the filtrate that's passing through the collecting duct, because atrial natriuretic peptide essentially inhibits the collecting duct from making sodium-potassium pumps. So both aldosterone and atrial natriuretic peptide are both hormones that are concerned with sodium concentrations, but they work in the opposite way. So next we'll just briefly look at tubular secretion. And we'll summarize which substances are moved here. So mainly tubular secretion is the kidney's process of eliminating unneeded substances from the blood. So typically things like ammonia and urea, which are both nitrogen-containing wastes, are eliminated through tubular secretion, as well as potassium. And potassium secretion will tend to increase as aldosterone secretion increases as well, because aldosterone is going to stimulate the formation of sodium-potassium pumps. And recall that with sodium-potassium pumps, if sodium is being pumped from the filtrate back into the bloodstream, potassium is moving the opposite direction through the sodium-potassium pump. It's moving from the bloodstream into the filtrate, right? So although aldosterone helps to promote the reabsorption of sodium from the filtrate back into the bloodstream, it's going to promote this. Aldosterone is going to promote the secretion of potassium in the blood from the blood into the filtrate, and this is actually okay, just because typically we need more sodium, specifically in the extracellular fluids of our body, and we don't need quite as much potassium. So typically our kidneys and the kidney tubules are trying to reabsorb a lot of sodium from the filtrate so that it's not lost to the urine. But at the same time, they're really trying to eliminate excess potassium at the same time, because we just simply don't need as much potassium as we do sodium. So potassium, it is an important mineral, but we don't need it in quite as high concentrations as sodium is. So generally in a healthy person, the kidney is trying to eliminate any excess potassium that's in the bloodstream. As we mentioned earlier, the part of the nephron that does the majority of tubular secretion, just like with tubular reabsorption, tubular secretion mostly takes place in the proximal convoluted tubule, but secretion can also take place along really the entire length of the kidney tubules. And certain places in the kidney tubules can kind of fine-tune what needs to be secreted, but generally most of the wastes are going to be eliminated from the proximal convoluted tubule. Just like we saw, the proximal convoluted tubule is the place where the majority of reabsorption is taking place. Next, we'll look at some physiology of the kidney tubules by defining osmolarity, or I guess I should say physiology of the body as a whole in terms of fluids and solute concentrations and things like that. Osmolarity is really just our measurement of how many solute particles are in a certain volume of water. And osmolarity is more specifically defined as the number of solute particles that are in a single kilogram of water. So it's not really important to kind of get an appreciation for the number here, but just know that the higher the osmolarity, the higher the number of solute particles are in that particular body fluid, right? So typical osmolarity of body fluids, both intra and extracellular fluids, are about 300 milliosmoles, somewhere in there. So those are going to be mostly water with some fairly dilute concentrations of sodium, potassium, glucose, calcium, that kind of thing. So with sodium really kind of being the major player in terms of contributing to fluid osmolarity and the solute concentrations that are in most of our cells and tissues. We'll look at countercurrent exchange next and where countercurrent exchange takes place. Countercurrent exchange, or just the term countercurrent in general, means that materials are exchanged between nearby vessels where fluid is flowing in the opposite direction. So you've got two parallel blood vessels, or two parallel vessels, I should say, in the case of something like the nephron loop, for example. So we have the descending limb and the ascending limb of the nephron loop. They're very close in proximity to one another, that is, they're nearby each other, and the fluids in them are flowing countercurrent to one another, that is, fluid is flowing down the descending limb and up the ascending limb. So in those two nearby vessels or structures, we got fluid flowing in opposite directions. And this allows very efficient exchange between the nephron loop and nearby blood vessels, so that when water and sodium are pulled out of the nephron, for example, the nephron loop, they can be picked up very quickly by the bloodstream and transported to where they're needed in the body. Right? So countercurrent simply means that materials are exchanged between nearby vessels. That could be blood vessels or kidney tubules where fluid is flowing in the opposite direction. And typically we see countercurrent exchange happening between the vessels of the nephron loop, that is the descending limb and the ascending limb, and the vasa recta or the paratubular capillaries that are nearby to reclaim the substances that are pulled out of those. So in our next kind of bullet point here, we saw that the nephron loop is capable of concentrating and then diluting the filtrate that's within it for the purpose of pulling both water and sodium out of the filtrate so that they can be put back into the bloodstream. And we call this mechanism the countercurrent multiplier. And the countercurrent multiplier, it's called that because it increases or multiplies the concentration of the filtrate that's flowing through it, right? And the multiplier occurs in the filtrate that's passing through the nephron loop. The descending limb is only permeable to water because it only has aquaporins in it, and the ascending limb is only permeable to sodium because it only has sodium-potassium pumps in it. So what we see is that as the filtrate moves down the descending limb, water leaves the filtrate, enters the bloodstream, which causes the filtrate to become more concentrated because water is leaving that filtrate. And then as filtrate moves up the ascending limb, we see that sodium leaves the filtrate, which once again dilutes the filtrate. And in doing so, the kidney has kind of used this as an advantage in order to be able to pull both water and sodium out of the filtrate at the same time. And so this is specifically how the kidney concentrates the filtrate and then dilutes the filtrate that's moving through the nephron loop in order to remove both water and sodium and put them back into the bloodstream. We see that at the base of the nephron loop, or the bottom of the nephron loop, the highest concentration in osmolarity that the nephron loop can create is 1200 milliosmoles, which is that is 4 times more concentrated than typical body fluid osmolarities are. And this is specifically why we cannot drink salt water or seawater as a source of fluid, because seawater is a higher concentration than 1200 milliosmoles. That is, there's more sodium and potassium and other electrolytes in it that cause its concentration to be higher than 1200 milliosmoles. So it's just not physiologically possible for our kidney to process the amount of sodium that's in seawater and effectively remove water while at the same time removing all that sodium, so that way we can become hydrated. So we don't see that that's very effective for our kidneys. We talked about the countercurrent exchanger already, the exchange between the fluid that's flowing through the kidney tubules, specifically the nephron loop, and reabsorption of water or sodium from those tubules back into the bloodstream. So we'll start to look next at some of the hormones and how they work. Specifically, we'll look at ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is produced by the posterior pituitary gland. And antidiuretic hormone functions to reabsorb water from the filtrate in the collecting duct. So if we are dehydrated, the posterior pituitary is going to secrete antidiuretic hormone. It's going to increase its secretion of antidiuretic hormone, which antidiuretic hormone is going to stimulate the creation of aquaporins in the collecting ducts. So when ADH levels go up in the bloodstream, then that means that more water is going to be pulled out of the filtrate at the collecting duct and put back into the bloodstream. So if we are overly hydrated, or if we are drinking alcohol, the secretion of antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary is going to be inhibited, because that's one of the effects of drinking alcohol, and that's why alcohol has the effect of producing high urine output, because it inhibits the secretion of ADH from the posterior pituitary. So what that means is that if less ADH is being secreted from the posterior pituitary, fewer aquaporins are going to appear in the collecting duct, and less water is going to move by osmosis from the filtrate back into the bloodstream. And so that's why being overly hydrated or by drinking alcohol, that our bodies create large volumes of very dilute urine. Real briefly examining both the fluid volume and solute composition of the fluid compartments in the body, we see that The three main fluid compartments are the intracellular fluid, which is the fluid that's within the body's cells, the interstitial or the tissue fluid, which is the fluid that exists between cells in a tissue, and then we also see the blood plasma as well. So technically you can kind of lump the interstitial fluid and the blood plasma together because they are both considered an extracellular fluid. They're both fluids that exist external to the cells of our body, but still, of course, between the tissues, between the cells that make up those tissues of our body. But they don't exist within a plasma membrane, if that makes sense. Intracellular fluid, that is the fluid inside of our cells, composes approximately 25 liters in total volume. Interstitial fluid is approximately 12 liters, and blood plasma is approximately 3 liters. So in total, we have about 40 liters of body fluids. 25 of those 40 liters is inside the cells, and 15 of those 40 liters is somewhere in the extracellular fluid space. That is, 12 of those is in the interstitial or the tissue fluid, and about 3 liters in blood plasma. And we primarily see that the main solute that is in the intracellular fluid is sodium, and in the interstitial and tissue fluid, it's going to be potassium. That's pretty high as one of the main solutes that's in there. And yeah, so that gives you kind of an idea of the approximate fluid volumes as well as the main solutes that are in those particular places in the body. In some of the last of the lectures in Module 6, we examined substances that are called electrolytes and other substances that are non-electrolytes. Electrolytes are defined as substances that dissolve in water to form ions, that is, they form charged particles. And because those particles have a charge, they have the ability to conduct electrical currents through fluids. And so that was an important component of how the muscles and the nervous system create action potentials in order to stimulate them for action. Non-electrolytes, on the other hand, they may be able to dissolve in water, but they don't form ions. That is, they don't form charged particles, and therefore they are not able to conduct electric currents. Even though there's plenty of extremely important non-electrolytes in the body, like glucose, they just simply don't have the same physical and chemical properties that electrolytes have. So, because electrolytes, when they dissolve into particles, they dissolve into two or more ions or charged particles. Electrolytes have greater osmotic power than non-electrolytes because when they dissolve, they form two or more particles, whereas when a non-electrolyte dissolves, it simply remains as one particle. So because of that, electrolytes tend to have greater osmotic power than non-electrolytes. Specifically sodium, just because sodium is in high enough concentration in enough of our body fluids that it is a very important electrolyte in terms of determining fluid balance as well as the movement of water between different fluid compartments in the body. So let's take a look at the major routes by which water enters and leaves the body. Most water is going to typically enter the body by consumption of beverages. So roughly 60% of our daily water that we obtain is going to be obtained through beverages and liquids that we consume. And similarly, most fluid is going to leave the body. Most of that water is going to leave the body through the urine. So there are other sources of water loss as well, but about 60% of our daily water loss comes from water loss through the urine. We talked about the feedback mechanisms already that regulate essentially the water concentration or the sodium concentration in our body's fluids and things like that. So really one of the triggers for thirst and one of the things that tells our brain that we're thirsty is that solute concentrations in the blood start to rise, and that essentially stimulates our brain to produce antidiuretic hormone, as well as produce other hormones that and stimulate other parts of things like the hypothalamus, particularly the thirst center of the hypothalamus that stimulates us to seek out water to drink. And that change in solute concentrations very much drives our behavior for seeking out water. So, And last but not least, we have the importance of obligatory water loss. So when I was talking about in my lectures the routes by which water leaves the body, the sources of water loss in the body are obligatory because there are systems like of course, the urinary system processes a lot of water, but also the digestive system uses thousands and thousands of milliliters of water each day in order to produce and secrete its digestive enzymes and juices. We also see that the respiratory system uses water to humidify the air that's coming into our lungs because the respiratory membrane has to be kept moist in order for oxygen to be able to diffuse across it from the air in the alveoli into the blood plasma and get picked up by the red blood cells. So the respiratory system uses water and water vapor, as well as the integumentary system, because we have to be able to sweat to thermoregulate and cool our bodies. So water losses from the urinary system, digestive system, respiratory, and integumentary systems, it's all necessary because water needs to be used by those systems in order for those systems to function as they're intended to. So the losses from those systems are both inevitable and cannot be prevented, and so that's why we have to consume a couple of liters of water each day at minimum, just to be able to balance what we're losing through those systems with the water that we're replenishing from the beverages that we consume.